On this episode of Newt's World, in his new book, Blood Money, Peter Schweizer and his team of forensic investigators spent more than 2 years scouring a trove of restricted Chinese military documents, data mining a mountain of American financial records, and tracking U.S. political leaders' investments and family businesses. Schweizer unloads bombshell after bombshell, exposing the Chinese Communist Party's covert operations in social media, the American drug trade, social justice movement, and the medical establishment to sow chaos in the United States. Here to talk about his new book, Blood Money, I am really pleased to welcome back my guest and good friend, Peter Schweizer. He is the president of the Government Accountability Institute and the former William J. Casey Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Peter, welcome and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Great to be with you, Newt, as always. Thanks for having me.
And I have to congratulate you. Blood Money is #1 on the New York Times hardcover nonfiction bestseller list this week. That's quite an achievement.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Newt. I just think it shows American people are concerned about their country and they think this topic is important, and I share that view, obviously.
Well, I want to start with something which is very current, which is I want to get your take on the House vote on Wednesday, passing a bill that would force TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance to either sell the app or be banned in the United States. You talk about TikTok's relationship to the Chinese Communist Party and Blood Money, and as you know, the House voted 352 to 65, and you had a huge bipartisan vote, but several Republicans and Democrats did express their opposition to the bill based on free speech concerns. What's your general reaction?
I'm very, very supportive of the bill. It certainly doesn't solve all the problems, but it solves some of them. The bottom line is that the Chinese Communist Party believes and knows that TikTok is a powerful tool to steer the conversation and manipulate young people in the United States. I quote in the book Chinese military officials calling it the ultimate Trojan horse. And the Chinese officials at ByteDance and in the government talk openly about how it is a powerful tool to manipulate young people. So there's no question the threat that it represents. And it seems to me the only solution here is to get this out of the control of the CCP.
Given Facebook and Google and everything else we've had in this country, why do you think TikTok took off so decisively? I think something like 170 million Americans use TikTok.
Yeah, two things, Newt. The first thing is that it really exploded because of the pandemic. So the pandemic, a lot of people were sitting around bored. The short video platform by design is highly addictive. That's part of the appeal of the algorithm. But the second thing I would say is that, and I discussed this in the book, when ByteDance unrolled TikTok, they explicitly marketed it to young people as a parent-free zone. The nature of the TikTok platform is such that it's not like Facebook or Twitter, now X, where other people can see the same feed that you're getting, or somebody can friend you to see what you're posting. The anonymous nature of this platform, TikTok, and the fact that each person gets a unique feed appealed to young people. And in fact, ByteDance pitched it as a parent-free zone. So I think that's the other reason it really took off. It's enormously popular, particularly among young people in America, and that is partly by design by this Chinese company.
Which frankly shows a pretty sophisticated level of awareness on their part that they could launch something like this in a world that has Apple and Microsoft and Facebook, et cetera. They've been pretty formidable competitors.
They have. And it's really the algorithm that is so powerful in essentially being able to predict what people want to see. The problem is that this algorithm is potent commercially, but the Chinese state has actually designated it as a state secret. So it's not only just a corporate secret, it's a state secret. And there's a lot of work that ByteDance, the parent company, does with the Chinese Ministry of State Security on the whole issue of manipulating people online. That's the explicit part of their research. So there's a lot of effort that goes into this, not just by ByteDance, but by the Chinese government as well.
So what are the prospects if this bill also passes the Senate and President Biden has already said that he would sign it? What are the prospects of the Chinese simply refuse to sell it and close it down?
Then I think it probably will be shut down. I think you're quite right to emphasize that China does not want to give up this tool. They see it as a powerful tool. My position is that we should have reciprocity with China. If we allow them to have these kinds of ownerships of media outlets in the United States, and TikTok is really the premier media outlet for people under the age of 40 in the United States, we ought to have the same access to their market. They're certainly not going to give that to us. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the Senate. I think there's going to be mounting opposition. TikTok is rallying the forces in terms of lobbying, et cetera. And honestly, call me a cynic, but I'm not sure that Joe Biden really wants to sign this bill. I feel like he has to say that he will sign the bill, but his real hope is that this thing is going to die in the Senate.
And given the size of the majority in the House, do you think there'll be enough fear of China pressure that the Senate will feel compelled to pass it?
I think it's really going to come down to the leadership on both sides, the Democrat leadership and then also Mitch McConnell in the Senate. McConnell, of course, is going to be giving up his mantle of leadership. But as I've highlighted before, I mean, there's a lot of things that I think Mitch McConnell has done well as a leader, but there is this entanglement with the family business in China. Essentially, if Mitch McConnell were to do something to really offend China, and I would say supporting this TikTok bill would be it, the Chinese government could destroy the Chow family business overnight. That would mean a heavy, heavy financial cost to Mitch McConnell and his wife. So I think it's really going to come down to leadership. This is an odd series of coalitions for and against this bill. You have in the House, and I think in the Senate, you're going to see the same thing. Some of the more libertarian members of the Senate, people like Rand Paul, who I agree with on a lot of issues, but I think has taken sort of an absolutist position that the government should not break up this company. And I think that's just an unrealistic look at what this threat really represents. On the other hand, you have people on the left who are perhaps not as concerned about China as you might consider, but they're concerned about big tech in general. And they see this as an opportunity to try to deal with it. So odd coalitions on both sides. I'm hoping the Senate will take it up and it will pass. But there's going to be a lot of twists and turns, I think, before that happens.
It's impossible to have a significant firm in China that is not acceptable to the Chinese Communist Party. It's just literally impossible. And so you have something like 130 Communist Party members who hold management positions at ByteDance. You have the content reviewers, mostly are Chinese Communist members. And you go down this list, 24 of the employees at ByteDance and TikTok worked at the People's Daily, which is the official mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. It seems to me as a national security matter, this shouldn't be a complicated issue.
No, I don't think it is. I mean, look, ByteDance, its offices are not far from the Ministry of State Security. They do joint research with the Ministry of State Security. They have ties to other parts of the Chinese government. The notion that we are going to give this company unfettered access to young people in America is patently absurd. And, when you go through and look at how the Chinese think about this, I quote from military officials and people from the Ministry of Propaganda, some of the internal documents where they discuss this. They lay it out explicitly how they use this to, in effect, deconstruct young people in America, to get them to reject their historic past, to reject national symbols, because by doing so, you can break them down and you can inculcate your own values into them. And keep in mind that the head of editorial content for ByteDance, which of course controls TikTok, the head of editorial control at ByteDance happens to be the head of the Chinese Communist Party cell at ByteDance. So we know what kind of editorial position that they're going to take. And to me, if this is not a red line that has been crossed, I don't know what the red line would be. So I will be absolutely staggered if there isn't a consensus forged that this bill doesn't pass.
How hard technically would it be to build a parallel algorithm if TikTok disappeared?
I don't think it'd be difficult. I think that some of the other companies that are out there have set up competitors, things like Reels. These are short video platforms, but they're not as potent as what ByteDance does. They're not as good. And what the ByteDance algorithm has always been about has been about addiction. ByteDance has recognized this from early on. That's why in China, they don't have TikTok, but they have an equivalent. It's called Douyin. Douyin, after 2 hours, it shuts off. You are not allowed to watch it continuously. That restriction on the product in the United States doesn't apply. So, yeah, you can develop algorithms, but the algorithm has to be designed perfectly, but it also needs to learn by the amount of data. And what ByteDance has such a head start on is it has billions of users around the world, and it feeds this algorithm, fine-tunes the algorithm. So whatever is out there competing against it is probably not going to be as good. But look, at the end of the day, I think, especially with the U.S. investors involved, if this bill passes, they're going to try to save the company by selling it to somebody in the United States, because otherwise these investors all lose their money. There's nothing left. TikTok has been banned in India. They lost hundreds of millions of users there. If it's banned in the United States, this product, has lost its luster and its value. So I think they're going to try to save it in some form.
A number of those investors are American, right?
Yes. They are. It's big investment firms like Carlyle Group has a stake. Jeff Yass, who's a big investor in Pennsylvania, has a large stake. The estimates there are his stake could be worth $50 billion. So there's a lot of money at stake. I certainly understand people have invested in a commercial venture. The problem is if you deal with China, you're going to have to expect that there's going to be these kinds of situations arise. If you're an investor in a Chinese company and you besmirch or criticize that company, they can actually take your ownership shares away. So they had to know going in that there were risks in these investments. I think their best solution, rather than fighting this bill, is to recognize that at least with this bill, they have an opportunity to make money by having this app sold to an American company. And maybe the Americans can retain their ownership stake. I don't see why not.
Yeah, it's probably conceivable that it could be turned over to the people who've already invested in it.
Yes, that's exactly right.
There's the concept of cognitive warfare. This is so different than the Western way of war. Can you sort of walk us through what do the Chinese mean when they talk about cognitive warfare?
Well, their view of warfare with the United States is very different than our concepts. They don't think exclusively or even largely in terms of a kinetic war. That is a war with missiles and tanks and people shooting at each other. They view it more holistically as a battle between the intellectual and creative power of China versus the United States. And so they call their strategy towards us disintegration warfare. This is based on a book published in 2010. President Xi has embraced it. And part of disintegration warfare, the name applies, of course, that they're seeking to disintegrate or fragment the United States. A subset of that is the cognitive war, which is to essentially dumb down and weaken the intellectual capacity of the United States. And this includes several facets. One of those, of course, is TikTok. The TikTok that we have is basically cotton candy. It's girls in blue hair screaming about one issue or the other. The equivalent in China, Douyin, is really about engineering, culture, history. It's a much more serious app. So that's part of the cognitive warfare. But it also includes other elements as well. There's a huge problem in the United States right now with illegal marijuana grows that are taking place. These are illegal operations from California to the state of Maine that are growing highly potent marijuana illegally. And the stunning reality is, according to law enforcement, 95% of these operations are run by Chinese nationals that are oftentimes illegally in the country. They get investment capital from China, and then they run these operations. They view marijuana, and particularly this potent marijuana that they grow, as another form of cognitive warfare that sort of dumbs down Americans. And of course, they make money along the way. So it's a huge problem, and we need to wake up. We need to have a strong military, but we need to recognize China does not mean to have a shooting war with the United States. They believe that they can defeat us without actually having to fight.
Part of what they talk about is the whole concept of information-driven mental warfare. And part of that, I was intrigued with a point you made, which is China's role in the video game industry. I mean, you wouldn't even think of this normally, but talk briefly about the whole concept of Tencent and the way in which they've moved into video games.
Yeah, it's pretty startling. I don't play video games, but I certainly have people in my life that do and enjoy it. China has invested in more than 800 video game companies in the West. And these include the companies that are producing the most popular games out there. That comes with a price, though. These investment dollars influence the theme and the elements of the story in a way that resonates with the CCP. So what that means is that they like games that highlight the strengths of China and the weakness or the failing power of the United States. And it's not blatant. It's oftentimes very, very subtle, but it's an important component of what they view are these cultural products. That includes TikTok. That includes video games. It also includes movies, animated movies and live action movies from Hollywood. And these cultural products they view as important weapons that are shaping the view that younger people around the world and the United States have towards the CCP. You see that in video games. You see that in movies. You can look at a movie like there was a movie a few years ago called The Martian with Matt Damon, where he's an astronaut, an American astronaut trapped on Mars. Well, that film was partly financed by the Chinese. And if you remember, what was the story? How did this American trapped on Mars get rescued? He got rescued by NASA, but NASA got special technology from China. That's how they were able to rescue this stranded American. And you see that repeated over and over and over again. Maybe in an isolated case, it's not a big deal. But if you're a young person and you continually see this theme of China superiority, American corruption, and laziness, you start to believe that the future does reside with China, not with the United States.
There's also an information gathering about you as a person. So the games you play, the things you value, combined with what you learn off of TikTok, they're acquiring a huge database of individual Americans on a scale that in our country would be illegal.
Yes, that's exactly right. And to your point about video games, a lot of people that do gaming now, they do gaming in groups, as a team, but the team members are, somewhere else. They're in a different city or a different state, and they communicate through these headsets with voice communications. Well, guess what? These game companies certainly can gather all that information, collect all that information. They now have a very nice voice imprint of you. You may be sharing personal information as you're talking to people on these game platforms. So yeah, the collection of data is an enormous problem. Of course, you play a lot of these online games. You're giving credit card information so you can get game updates, et cetera. All of this is going to these companies. And even if it's a US-based company, the agreements include that the Chinese investors in these companies get access to the data under the guise that it helps them improve the product. But once it's shared with China, of course, now you can assume that it's going to be shared with the Chinese state.
You use a term that the Chinese communists see video games as national cultural exports. Again, this whole notion of non-kinetic warfare, competition by non-military means, the idea that you would create video games as a national cultural export, I think, is fascinating. Of course, then it's the opposite of the American left. You couldn't today create an American game, say, about George Washington as a noble leader, because the American left would go crazy.
That's right. There is a certain sense that you have to respect that China is proudly pushing faith in their system and their belief system. The problem is, of course, we know how dangerous and how many people have suffered under that system. But you have to give them credit. They're confident about it. They push it. They demand it. And the problem is that people in our entertainment industry, whether it's the video game industry or Hollywood, are prepared to pay along because they're getting access to capital. They're getting access to the Chinese market oftentimes. And it really does put us at a disadvantage. President Xi himself has emphasized repeatedly how important these cultural products are and how they will serve to sort of disconnect young people in the West from their historical knowledge of their own country and disconnect them from respecting or embracing the national symbols that young people have in the West. And all you have to do is look at where the tide is turning culturally in the United States and believe that A, they're very pleased with that, and B, that their cultural export efforts are working quite well.
You point out in your book that of the 100 highest grossing movies released between 2014 and 18, 41 had Chinese investors. But in addition, in order to get access to the Chinese market, you have to make sure your movie is approvable. I think in the second version of Top Gun, they actually had to take off a Taiwanese flag that was on an Air Force jacket because it offended the Chinese communists.
Yes, they did. And you can even look at children's programming. So Steven Spielberg and Jeffrey Katzenberg with Amblin Entertainment and DreamWorks struck a deal with the Chinese for investments and access to the Chinese market. And all you have to do is look at the progression of the animated movies that have been made, Kung Fu Panda 1, 2, and 3. The first two were American funded, and the themes of those films were good. It was about elevating yourself as an individual by embracing character and hard work and improving yourself and having confidence and belief in yourself. Really good themes for young people to hear. When you get to Kung Fu Panda 3, which is partly financed by China, which gives them veto power over the script, that theme changes entirely. Kung Fu Panda 3, essentially, there's a people's revolt. It's no longer focused on the panda trying to improve himself, make himself better so he can help other people. Kung Fu Panda 3 is about a people's revolt against the overlords. And that is, I think, because of the source of this funding. And you see this theme over and over again in some of the Transformer movies, where it's China that comes to the rescue. It's the Chinese officials that are well motivated and earnest, and the American officials that are corrupt and self-serving. That theme is repeated over and over again. And, you could say, well, is that a big deal? I think it's a big deal because it shapes the way that people, especially young people, see their own culture, see their own country, and see their own leaders. And if they are being fed a diet which is always embracing and upholding the CCP and criticizing America, that is absolutely going to have a powerful cultural effect. And I think we're already starting to see that.
In Blood Money, you write, and I think this is a very sobering quote that I wish every member of Congress understood. Many people fear that a war with China may be coming, but the war is already here. Now, what war are you describing?
I'm describing the disintegration warfare that's taking place, and it's not just in the realm of these cultural products. It actually includes the dying and the death of Americans, and I believe that China is responsible for those. If you look at fentanyl, for example, much of the focus is on the Mexican drug cartels. I think I explained clearly the fact that the drug cartels are really the junior partners here. This is a Chinese operation from head to tail. They are the senior partners. It's not just that they provide the precursors that come from China. They provide all the infrastructure. There are 2,000 Chinese nationals just south of the U.S. border in Mexico that help the cartels turn these precursors into fentanyl. When these drug cartels produce the pills that are poisoning people, that look like a Vicodin or look like an Adderall, that are laced with fentanyl, those pill presses came from China. And according to our Department of Homeland Security, China sells those to the drug cartels at cost. This is not a price gouging operation. The communication devices that the cartels use to evade U.S. law enforcement, they use Chinese apps and Chinese communication devices because they know that Beijing will not share those with U.S. law enforcement. And then the final element of it, which is the money laundering. These drug cartels for so long laundered their money in Latin American banks. Today, in the era of fentanyl, they launder their money in Chinese state-owned banks. And according to our government, they often use Chinese students in the United States on education visas to do the laundering for them. So this is a Chinese operation. The drug cartels are a junior partner, and this is an example of the kind of war that we are already in. This is now the leading cause of death for people under the age of 45 in the country.
You also point out that the triads, which are the historic Chinese organized crime systems, actually in 1982 made an agreement with the Chinese Communist Party, and in effect, the triads are a major component of trying to get drugs into the United States and trying to undermine American culture.
Yeah, this was a bargain struck by Deng Xiaoping and some of the triad leaders in 1982. Deng Xiaoping said, as long as you are patriotic, by what he means is support the CCP, we will let you operate freely in the West. Just don't sell your drugs in China and be loyal to the CCP. And so that bargain was struck. And if you look at President Xi today, he is the personification of that. His development politically, the area that he served the longest time in the CCP apparatus was in Fujian province. And Fujian province is the epicenter of Chinese organized crime activity. And when he was there, there were numerous organized crime figures that were wanted by U.S. federal authorities for crimes like murder for hire, drug distribution, et cetera, who fled to Fujian province, where then Xi Jinping gave them protection and became friends with them. In fact, the Fujian province airport, believe it or not, was privatized and owned by these organized crime syndicates under President Xi. So they see these organized crime elements as a powerful tool to advance their agenda. And of course, the triads like this relationship because China gives them now a safe base of operation.
Why is it so hard for the American government to recognize that? You make the point that in late 2022, the Biden administration names 22 countries as transit points for drugs or producers of drugs, but doesn't list China.
Yeah.
What does all of this tell you?
Well, I think there's a couple of things at work here, Newt. I think part of it is you've got a larger bureaucracy that realizes once you sort of finger China as being involved in this drug trade at the State Department, their job suddenly becomes a lot harder. So I think you have just some bureaucratic inertia, but more specifically to the Biden administration, let's be clear what the exact financial ties are here. You and I have talked about before our research about the Bidens receiving millions of dollars from China. Consider the fact that in 2017, the Biden family received, and they don't dispute this, they received a $5 million interest-free forgivable loan that they've never paid back from a Chinese businessman who was business partners with a gentleman named Zhang Anlo, who also goes by the name White Wolf, who's the head of a criminal gang, UBG, that set up the Sinaloa cartel and made them the kings of fentanyl. Everybody acknowledges this is the criminal gang that set them up. So what that means is you have basically 1 degree of separation between the Biden family and these criminal gangs. It's in the form of this businessman who loaned them $5 million in 2017. So when you ask yourself, does Joe Biden want to have a conversation? Does he want to call out the Chinese criminal gangs involved in this activity? I don't think he does. And I think a big part of the reason is because of these financial entanglements that exist between him, his family, and these Chinese gangs.
To what extent do the billionaires who made huge profits in China form an impediment to us coming to grips with how deep the Chinese threat is?
It's a huge problem because they recognize and see, China does, they see Silicon Valley and Wall Street as their most effective lobbyists in the West. They don't need to lobby themselves. And all you have to do is go back and look at the Trump administration when they imposed trade tariffs on China. Whether one agrees with that approach or not, it doesn't matter because what matters is what happened next. China didn't go to Washington, D.C. and protest. They went to Wall Street and they went to Silicon Valley and they went to those big, powerful firms and said, look, you want access to our market, you need to go fix this. So you had Wall Street titans and you had big tech titans rushing to Washington, D.C., meeting with cabinet officials in the Trump administration, trying to get these tariffs removed. It's an enormous impediment. These companies are thinking short term. They think this is the same China as it was under Hu Jintao. It's not. It's a very different China. This is President Xi's China, and his views of these corporations and markets is very, very different than any Chinese leader that they've had really since Deng Xiaoping. And they need to wise up to it. But right now, they are the most useful tool for getting Beijing's agenda advanced in the United States and Washington, D.C.
So given that pattern, do you fully expect them to pile on to try to stop the Senate from passing the TikTok bill?
Yes, I do. I think so. Carlyle Group, for example, is a part owner of ByteDance. They will certainly push, but I think there are some of the big investment houses that do huge business in China. They are going to be leveraged by the Chinese government to lobby on this as well. And they're going to argue on good old free market capitalist grounds that the state should not be allowed to seize assets and force the sale to someone else. Never mind, that happens in China all the time. But they're going to try to manipulate it in this way. I do think that people are they're becoming more aware that this is the methodology. But yes, there's going to be a heavy, heavy lobbying push in the Senate to kill this bill.
I think the very title of your book, Blood Money, Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans, that by itself should tell every American to focus on the Senate and get the Senate to understand this is about American national survival, and that we have to have a dramatically tougher and more coherent approach to China. I think your book is a major contribution to helping us understand that we are engaged basically in total societal warfare with a Chinese dictatorship which seeks at every level to undermine and destroy us, and that we had better be developing national strategies that are equally sophisticated and, given the scale of our capabilities, dramatically more powerful once we're engaged. But, Peter, I can't tell you how important I think your new book is. It is the most important contribution you've made in a lifetime of doing extraordinary research, and I think it is going to have a very, very big impact on the American people and on the history of this country. So Blood Money is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I want to really thank you for joining me to talk about a topic where you are a genuine heroic pioneer.
Well, thank you so much, Newt. It's always great to join you. I always enjoy the stimulating conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to my guest, Peter Schweizer. You can get a link to buy his new book, Blood Money, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.